Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Jim Phillips. He's a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. And in Los Angeles, we have liberal commentator Peter Mathews. Thanks both so much for joining us. Peter, let me start with you. Is what we're seeing in the United States right now, is it isolationism, or is this something unique that equates to kind of unprecedented, maybe unilateral action that Trump defines as America first?
I think it's much more the latter. It's not isolationism because Trump is still heavily involved. For example, the decision about the capital moving to Jerusalem and his decision to, hit Syria with missiles and make statements about the, parts of the world. So it's not just isolationism. I think it has to do with the type of involvement that I don't think is always the best, because we need to be more focused on economic development throughout the world, on being partners with our countries to develop their economies and be for social justice, for working people to do well, and not just for the big corporations to do well and having the U.S. have troops all over the world. That should actually be reversed. So it's not isolationism, and we have to be involved in any way. It has to be on a socially just, fair way, and not just dominant way where one country dictates the whole world.
Okay, Jim Phillips, let me get your take on that.
I would agree with him. I don't think it is isolationism. President Trump has escalated the U.S. commitment in Afghanistan. He's accelerated what I would consider an inevitable confrontation with Iran over the nuclear deal. If he was truly isolationist, I think he would have just washed his hands and let Iran slow walk to a nuclear weapon after 15 years, after the key restrictions on uranium enrichment expire. But he didn't do that. He walked away from the deal and explicitly said he's open for negotiations, which means further involvement with Iran.
Okay, so if it's not isolationism, is it possible, though, that at least many of the United States' foreign allies would like to, at least in a sense, Peter, let me get your take on this, isolate the United States more so they can try to bypass some of Trump's more controversial decisions, i.e. the Iran nuclear deal?
Absolutely, because they feel that the U.S. is acting unilaterally in its own national interest. It's not even a national interest, but a dominant interest. And they want to say, look, let's make this more a collective effort. And if we have to get together ourselves with other countries, Russia, China, the European Union, we're going to put things together so we can continue more of a multi-dimensional foreign policy that'll help people in the world and keep peace. Now, the United States America First policy is quite antithetical to that, because when you say America First, it's a very national, super nationalistic policy that says, whatever the world does, it doesn't matter too much to us. We have to just do what's in our interest, and quite often it's not in our interest what happens under that policy. Instead, it's more unilateral, it is less diplomatic, it's more confrontational, and certainly more unpredictable, as President Trump showed us when he was talking to North Korea in such very offensive terms about 6-8 months ago. That's very dangerous, to talk as if the U.S. is the only country in the world that counts or that should dominate the whole international system. And believe me, there should be also soft power. We should be using power that, as Professor Joseph Nye of Harvard has said, soft power, the power of example, the power of admiration of our values, and also economic involvement with other countries, helping them, helping uplift and have joint ventures to build infrastructure. Those things can go a long ways to having U.S. influence, and this America First policy will be a disaster in the end if it continues this way.
Okay, Peter, and I'll raise this now with Jim. You brought up the North Korea example. Jim, I mean, many say now that it's actually Trump's unilateral bravado and the language he uses, however controversial it might be, that actually got North and South Korea to the table and is leading to these peace negotiations now on a scale we've never seen before. Is that what it is? Do you agree with Peter, or is Trump doing the right thing, at least in certain foreign policy directions?
No, I would disagree with Peter, because although I would agree that some of his language is disruptive, that's part of his populist appeal to middle America that are tired of the politically correct bureaucratic language that many previous presidents spoke. And the fact that he is disruptive, he is provocative, and he does think out of the box, I think led to the negotiations with North Korea. You know, the jury's still out on how they're going to go. I myself am a little skeptical that this will be a productive agreement in the long run, but I think soon you'll also see this administration engaging with Iran and trying to renegotiate that a very bad and controversial Iran nuclear deal.
Okay, let me bring in now from Clute, Texas, Ron Paul. He is a two-time presidential candidate, also the host of the Ron Paul Liberty Report. Ron Paul, thanks so much for joining us. Unfortunately, you missed the first few minutes of our conversation here, but let me just ask you this. I mean, does Trump's foreign policy equate to isolationism, or is this just America's new unilateral approach under America First?
Well, he's not an isolationist, I'll tell you that, and he's not a non-interventionist. So he's very much involved economically in everything he does. He's very much involved in throwing our military around the world, very much involved. But he is not a non-interventionist. That's what libertarians are. We're non-interventionists, that we don't get involved in the internal affairs of other nations and economic policies. We don't get involved in civil wars that are none of our business, and we just stay out of it. But Trump is very much involved economically. You can't figure him out at times, because some days he's saying one thing and another on another day, and some of it might be distraction, and the so-called positive things coming out of Korea might be a distraction so he can go and stir up trouble in Iran. That's the way I see it, because in one sense it sounds like he's calming something down. In the other sense, he looks like he's trying to start the next major war. So a non-interventionist, a libertarian, wants us to stay out of that, because we've just especially looked at the last 15 years of the Middle East, and it's a total tragedy. And we're in 120 some countries, and we're broke, and all we do is throw our weight around, and I think it all comes back to haunt us.
Let me get back to Peter then on this one. There is a real issue then?
I just want to say that Congressman Paul is spot on this, and it is so true that we have 1,000 military bases around the world in 150 countries. That's not non-intervention, and Trump hasn't done anything to reverse that or to bring our resources more toward the home front, which he should be doing. And furthermore, this North Korea situation is not resolved yet. We don't know how it's going to turn out. I'm hoping it turns out well. And the president got there through very provocative, unpredictable kinds of statements, which may not have gotten us there if things had gone just slightly a little differently. So we can't say that he's doing well, you know, with the North Korea situation or with Iran. That was wrong, pulling out unilaterally from the Iran, the JCPOA, which almost all the major countries of the world had negotiated, 6 countries, and the other major countries supported it. This is something the United States should not do. It is not non-interventionist. This is more of a America First, super nationalist policies, not really looking carefully at all of the factors involved in complex foreign policy making.
Jim Phillips, let me ask you this. I mean, is it fair to say that there are very disproportionate consequences for this administration's decisions in particular? For example, Americans themselves, the Americans that he's catering to, will not feel the impact of pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal or moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, for that matter. But millions of people in the Middle East will feel those effects, and they will suffer. Is that fair?
I think our allies in the Middle East, particularly Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and other members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, are very encouraged by the fact that the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. And I think one of the only achievements of the Obama Middle East policy was by reaching out to Iran, it brought Israel and Saudi Arabia together. And because both see Iran as a greater threat than the other one. So in that respect, I think our allies in the Middle East very much support that break from the Iran nuclear deal. Okay,
Ron Paul, go ahead.
Well, you know, on the deal, you know, if we were back 10 or 15 years ago, an interventionist, a non-interventionist, a libertarian wouldn't be looking for more these international agreements. That doesn't make us an isolationist. It doesn't. It just means we're non-interventionist. But when you have something moving in the right direction, you don't want to disrupt it. And that's why I say it's a mistake to go in and unilaterally, you know, try to close that deal down. I think it has set the stage for some serious problems. I think that we have lost a lot of credibility. I think we're going to get China and Russia and Iran lined up with Europe for financial reasons. And I think it raises the chances of a blowback incident. People are upset. And you take what's going on in Jerusalem, that's setting the stage for another blowback incident, because the one thing listed by Al-Qaeda for the reason of 9/11 was our unilateral treatment of mistreatment of the Palestinians, that we did not treat them fairly, and we were on the other side of that. And that was one of their resentments. So I think the conditions of the world are still very, very dangerous, possibly for different reasons than others think. Some people say we're dangerous because we're not, taking on Iran more forcefully. But I would say our aggressiveness over there is setting the stage. But I want to make one quick point, if I can, and that is that non-intervention is not isolationism. Some people get that mixed up. Free traders and travel and sharing our experiences and getting along with people and having friendships, that's the way you thwart wars. But that is not isolationism. Interventionism is a more isolationist philosophy, because they believe in sanctions and telling people what to do, and if they don't do it, we threaten them with bombs. So I think the definitions of these terms are very important.
Fair enough. Peter, if I can, let me just go back to a question I asked earlier before Ron joined us. Can U.S. allies begin to genuinely bypass the United States now in international agreements? Or is the United States, still being the world's only superpower, just too important to get around? Does nobody have a choice but to deal head-on with the United States in foreign policy now?
U.S. allies and some of the competitors could get together in an action to oppose a unipolar world. The U.S. had a unipolar world, one center of power. We were dominant when the Soviet Union fell apart. And that doesn't last for very long in history. What happens is other countries get together and they put their resources together, they put the diplomacy together, and sometimes their militaries together to oppose the one superpower that seems to be pushing people around. And I think Congressman Paul was absolutely right. This should not be it should be an even-handed treatment of Israel and Palestine. We know Israel is one of our strongest allies in the Middle East, but there's no reason that President Trump had to move the capital by moving our embassy to Jerusalem before the settlement had occurred, with both Palestine and Israel having their own capitals in East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, which was part of the negotiations in the long run. And we have to make sure the settlements are moved out and let the Palestinians have their territory back. That would be a more even-handed way of dealing with things, and people would see the U.S. is a broker that is fair. And until we do that, we are under security threat. There will be a lot of reaction and blowback, and who knows if some incident might not occur here in the United States, not just around the world in the Middle East, but something come back here to hit us here. We have to be more fair about this and more multilateral once again. And I do believe what also the Congressman said, that we have to encourage trade, we have to encourage travel, exchange of ideas, investment in each other's economies, and that can grow the world's economy in a fair trade manner, not a free trade one.
Okay, Jim Phillips, might the United States become less internationally relevant now? And can I ask, do you think Americans will even care what their position really is on the world stage?
No, I think Americans care, and I think one of the things they care about is that the U.S. stands with its allies. And particularly in the Middle East, that means standing with Israel against Hamas, a terrorist group that is not only opposed to peace, but is opposed to Israel's existence. And as long as Hamas has a chokehold on Gaza, there can be no peace. And that's one of the reasons why I think that by moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem and explicitly saying that it is possible for the U.S. to open up a embassy for Palestinians in Jerusalem at a later date, that leaves open the possibility of a negotiated peace, which looks more and more improbable. But nonetheless, it signals to Palestinians that they don't have veto power over the sovereign decision of the United States to decide where it puts its embassy. I mean, previously, there was a diplomatic facility in East Jerusalem for U.S. diplomats to talk to Palestinians, but there was no diplomatic facility elsewhere in Jerusalem to talk to Israelis. And I think that's a historic anomaly that has been corrected.
Okay. Let me get to Ron then.
Do you mind if I interject? May I make a comment on that, please?
Indeed, go ahead.
May I make a quick comment on that, if you don't mind? Yeah, I wanted to mention what Jim said. There's something else here, and that UN Resolution 242 is extremely important. That's the one the world rests its decisions on, basically, and the resolution was legal. It becomes part of international law, and that called for a two-state solution, with each of the countries having, Palestine and Israel, having their capitals in Jerusalem, and having non-occupation of territory. That has to be adhered to. The U.S. has to be a firm supporter of UN Resolution 242, and they'll go and veer off in one-sided directions, which can cause this kind of blowback we're seeing right now today.
Ron Paul, do you think the United States wants to be a superpower? Do they want the responsibility that that entails? What does, if you can speak to your constituents, what does the average American voter really want?
Well, I think everybody in every country wants to be, a superpower, influential, and an example. But the superpower you're talking about, I think, is the wrong way to go. I'd like to think of American exceptionalism, but it's quite a bit different than us going over and telling people how to run their elections and who should be in charge of their government and using our CIA to overthrow governments. But I think we should be an exceptional nation on setting examples on free markets and civil liberties and these sort of things so other people want to emulate us. But you also ask about is our position being challenged around the world? And I said definitely, especially on this recent episode of what we're doing and getting out of the agreement with Iran. I think we've been knocked down. We will be, but I think it's going to be involved in economics as much as anything, because the petrodollar will eventually be challenged, and then there'll be a petro yuan, and these other currencies are going to challenge us. Our debt is outrageous. We cannot maintain it. And we will get knocked down, not because anybody's going to invade us, not because anybody's going to threaten us with nuclear weapons, not because Syria is going to attack us, Iraq didn't attack us. We're going to be challenged because of our own stupidity of running up a $21 trillion debt, and it's endless. And this administration is making it worse than ever. That will challenge the dollar. And if you look at the countries that we really go after, are the countries that have challenged the dollar. But the dollar will have to go down eventually because it's unsustainable. We just can't print money forever, taking care of all our welfare needs at home and policing the world.
Okay.
Right now, people still trust the dollar, but it's not so much as it used to be, and that will eventually change.
It's interesting. Jim, let me ask you on that question. I mean, given where the United States is economically, but the fact that the United States is still the world's consumer engine, Trump's stance now, America first, bring American jobs back. But the truth is Americans don't want to, and most of them really can't afford to pay for American wage products and manufacturing. So I'd like to get your take on what Ron was saying as well, where you think the U.S. then is headed economically with this type of Trump-led policy.
Well, I would agree with Mr. Paul that one of these strongest threats to the U.S. Foreign policy is our indebtedness and the overall economic situation, which is, I think, one thing that led the president to articulate his foreign policy of America first, that he doesn't want to see the U.S. go further in debt to provide security to many allies that perhaps don't pull their own weight in terms of defense spending or providing for their own security. I myself don't like the phrase American first because I have a long enough memory to see it as the wrong response to the rise of Hitler in Europe. But I think President Trump implies that America first in economic terms in order to reduce the exploding threat that Mr. Paul talks about.
Okay. Jim Phillips, I will have to give you the final word because unfortunately we're out of time for this segment. I'd like to thank you and Peter Mathews and Ron Paul so much for joining us there on this segment of the Newsmakers.
Thank you.